Hey everyone, this is a special episode of my game review series because it's a lost episode. There's a reason for this. I ruthlessly hated playing this game. It does have its perks, but overall I believe it is one of the worst shooters ever made. It's in the same league as dreadful shooters like Chaser, Merger 3D, and Sniper Art of Victory for me. Even watching my footage while editing made me relive the agitation, so this video ended up in editing purgatory for about 6 months. I felt that my extreme negativity gave the review a bad vibe and worried that people might not want to watch me complain for 40 minutes. Then I remembered how most other game reviewers reach prominence, so... That being said, I don't like letting my efforts go to waste. So I finished up the editing and made sporadic refinements and retakes, but otherwise I've left the video as it was originally written and planned. Hopefully it was worth me going through my own personal gaming Vietnam. Enjoy. I'm going to do something very different than usual by setting the stage for how messy this game is right out the gate. Today's game is 7554, a Call of Duty clone from Vietnam. I'll get into its background more in a minute. As you'd probably expect, it has a mission as blatantly inspired by All Gillied Up, meaning it's a highly scripted stealth sniping theme park. It has this one specific segment where your partners ask you to pick off a specific enemy while they snipe his friends. That seems straightforward, doesn't it? Well, there are numerous problems here. Your partners don't give you a cue when they'll fire, don't tell you specifically who to target, don't even target the guys they say they'll target, miss their shots, and sit around doing nothing after they miss. Contrasting your partners, these enemies could pass the eye final exam with a perfect score. Despite you being prone in a ghillie suit, these random enemies with semi-auto World War II era rifles start landing every shot on you from half a mile away. Assuming you survive their initial barrage, this section then turns into a ludicrously prolonged and painful game of regenerating health whack-a-mole. I have never seen a segment like this butchered this badly before, and that's only dipping my toes into how carelessly put together this game tends to be. So, welcome to 7554, Glorious Memories Revived, often just called 7554. I went into it expecting a hidden gem, and ended up with one of the most unpleasant games I've played in years. People like me are legally obligated to cover a genuinely bad game now and again, so I guess this is the universe naturally balancing out. It was developed by the Vietnamese Amobi Games, who are now known as Hiker Games. They went the route of mobile games, probably because 7554's reception was as lukewarm as a burrito in a back alley dumpster. It was released in 2011, which was in the latter half of the period where most shooters wanted to write off the coattails of Call of Duty. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with being inspired by another piece of media, especially one as influential and beloved but also kinda polarizing as Call of Duty. However, this game is unbelievably derivative in addition to it lacking the polish that makes its inspiration stand out in the first place. It's just a standard, linear, cinematic, action-packed military campaign on what may as well be a shoestring budget. It doesn't have multiplayer, which definitely wouldn't have helped its case back in the day. Oh, and they shoehorned a zombies mode in there too. I'll talk about that in its own section. Fundamentally, 7554 is probably fairly familiar to anyone who's first-person shootered a good few times in their life. There's a handful of things that make 7554 a unique curiosity in the history of the genre. It's one of the first Vietnamese forays into the big-budget gaming market, and it received some mild international attention back when it came out. Not enough to really give it any staying power, though. What really sets it apart is the fact that it focuses on the First Indochina War, a topic effectively never mentioned in media out here in the West. You're playing as a set of Vietnamese soldiers fighting against the French, so it's a unique and refreshing perspective to play from. You take the role of people defending their country, which is a first for the military shooter subgenre, and to get it out of the way, the title, 7554, is the last day of the war, the 7th of May, 1954. Spoiler alert, it ended with a Vietnamese victory. 7554 is unique in that it became freeware. Back in 2019, the developers started giving it away for free on its official website, 7554.vn. However, as of uploading, it's technically not freeware anymore, as the website is currently down. I don't know if this is temporary or not, but the Wikipedia page acknowledges it, which is certainly not a good sign. This could date the video, but if you can't access the site, just use the Wayback Machine. Honestly, downloading the game this way may be far better than what I had to go through. Obtaining the game back in November 2022 was a wild journey for me. The download server was in Vietnam, so it took over a full day to download this 4GB game. Yeah, it was ridiculous. I saved a mere single screenshot of my progress through the download, which should give you an idea how dumb I was for not just finding a non-Vietnamese download mirror. It ultimately took 25.5 hours. After you get through that Buddhist test of patience, you can be thankful for the fact that 7554 runs out of the box on modern systems, so no need to sacrifice any lambs. I've been going through my lambs way too quickly anymore anyways. However, when you boot the game up for the first time, everything will be in Vietnamese. You can change it to English if you can intuit your way through the menu like I did. It was weird how quickly I was able to do that. I wish I recorded it. Anyways, changing the language to English only affects menus, objectives, and captions, so the voice work is still in Vietnamese and French. The translation is sub-Google Translate circa 2010 quality. It is riddled with typos, bad grammar, tense changes, inconsistent capitalization, you'd name it. Any English mistake that could be made probably was made here. I was still able to make my way through the game because it's pretty linear, but it certainly adds a layer of uncertainty to the experience. This is the third game I played from my channel to feature a super slapdash English translation, and it certainly won't be the last. I get a lot of amusement out of things like Chinese instruction manuals, so this is an upside for me. It was one of my few sources of joy in this train wreck pile-up in motion. Yeah, I don't like this game. I don't have too much more to comment on here, so let's jump to the story. 7554's story is rather confusing to me as someone who isn't very familiar with the war or the geography of Vietnam, which it seemingly does expect you to be familiar with. It certainly doesn't help that the game switches between 4 separate characters. Calling them characters feels like a bit of a stretch, because altogether they have less personality than any of the guns you can pick up. They're all difficult to distinguish from each other since they're mostly silent and lacking in both personality and backstory. This may be easier to follow if you're actually Vietnamese, and can remember names, though I doubt you'd glean that much more from it. Ultimately, it's focused on the story of the Indochina War itself, so there isn't really a personal story since you're just hopping between battles throughout the war. The game starts with a fairly flavorful cinematic, giving you a summary of the events leading up to the war and some interesting context for the first level. However, the cinematics become a lot more subdued after this and tend to focus on maps of Vietnam. Yeah, I wasn't joking about the Vietnamese geography thing. Maybe this appeals to people who are interested in this side of the war, but I didn't find most of these particularly enticing. It doesn't help that the audio mixing is abysmal in these. They're 15 decibels or so louder than everything else in the game, so it's like a slightly worse version of my audio mixing. You can skip them, but it takes most of the cutscene for the levels to load. I ended up dreading these loading screens. Like I said, there are 4 protagonists switching between levels, but if the game didn't momentarily bring this up in a text prompt at the start of each level, I don't think I would have known this. In fact, in most levels you may as well be a nameless grunt. This could be a cultural thing, but both the main and side characters have close to zero banter and personality. Games that inspired 7554, such as World at War, gave you some named side characters who, in addition to fighting alongside of you, would talk and interact with each other. This helps players buy into the setting, characters, and gives at least a vague sense of more personal camaraderie. Here, anyone with a name or objective marker is just a soulless, invincible killing machine that mostly benefits me. They've got plot armor, and I've got their plot armored bodies as armor. To summarize, I didn't care if any of the characters lived or died beyond the idea of losing out on a precious friendly meat shield. Beyond that, the in-game cinematics are hilarious. Some of them are admittedly fairly well realized, with their amateurishness being more charming than anything else. But then a good few are just white text on a black background. That's a pretty boring way of conveying information, especially after the intro cutscene, though the bad grammar is fun in these. The thing that tickles me the most, however, is the amount of scenes that end up being more funny than anything else. The game would have these flashy, dramatic, fairly well put together cinematic death scenes, but I'm usually just sitting back wondering, who was that? It's often played really heroically, just baffling me further. I love the awkward addition of slow-mo too, like they didn't know how to make a scene dramatic and cinematic in any other way. At least these start off with decent production value, but they get very cheap as the game goes on. In fact, spoiler alert again, the game suddenly kills off most of its cast in the last few missions, making it feel like the story's late for work and desperate to try raising the stakes. I would say it's usually in rather unflattering ways, but judging how I die in the actual gameplay, I guess they tend to make sense. One of the playable characters literally just dies to being shot. In fact, this is the game's only actual emotional story beat. The guy getting quickscoped here is An, the brother of the character who is effectively the protagonist, Bin. Bin's character arc is effectively, I hope my brother is alright, with this being the only semblance of backstory or motivation any of the characters gets. So naturally he meets his brother on the final level. I knew where this was going from the other side of the Pacific. An dies in this really clumsy and low effort cutscene, and then the game literally just ends. No further development of Bin's character, no final battle, no sappy revenge scene, nothing. The story abruptly stops with no real closure or development for its only character, like they had to cut the play short because they accidentally shot On's actor with a real bullet. This may actually be among the worst endings to a campaign I've ever seen. It's a complete anticlimax that ambushes you. It's as unsatisfactory as it could possibly be. I guess the story wasn't really something they cared about? I would be fine with that, but it does seem odd to try making a cinematic military campaign without at least trying to give it some soul. Even some of the most mediocre boots-on-the-ground war shooters go the extra mile to give you some camaraderie. Maybe they just really wanted to focus on the Indochina War, but I guess then why waste our time with the characters at all then? Now, I respect this game for showing a significant conflict from a non-Western perspective. It's incredibly refreshing, and I wish more media in general was willing to do this. This was obviously a big gamble for the developers, and unfortunately they lost. Though, despite the huge focus on the Indochina War, something tells me this game isn't the ideal way to learn about Vietnamese history. Even if it was, it's still presented in a rather bland way most of the time, and it's stapled to a game that plays poorly. More on that shortly. Well, I've been on this long enough. It's time to actually jump into the game. Let's talk about the presentation. The graphics are fairly decent for a country's first jab at the AAA market. Some places have good atmosphere, and there is decent variation in locations and time of day. Well, mostly. It is weird when the time of day abruptly changes mid-mission. There's also a few too many levels that take place in trenches. They at least try to distinguish these levels to an extent. Some of them are bright and filled with foliage, others are dark and desolate like they take place in the middle of a war or something. Some of the more intense levels do a good job making it feel like a big battle is going on, which is rather impressive. Though it is annoying that you can actually be killed by the random ambient, for the lack of a better word, mortar fire. I also appreciate the attempt at lush jungle in some levels. It's obnoxious to actually play in these levels since the French seemingly have heat vision, yet it's a far more impressive shot at jungle than a lot of bigger budget titles. What really hurts these is 7554's god-awful anti-aliasing and the quality of its shadows. The options menu only lets you toggle anti-aliasing on or off, and boy is it weak. I tried brute forcing it to the max outside of the game, but it didn't seem to help on top of greatly harming the performance. So no matter what, the vegetation and chicken wire are constantly dancing in the corners of my eyes with no ways to fix it. As far as I'm aware, this isn't how the Vietnamese see the world. I played very few games that would be so vastly graphically improved with better anti-aliasing than 7554. I'm finding that bad anti-aliasing is becoming a growing pet peeve of mine. I otherwise have little more to say about the visuals. It's what you'd expect for a 2011 game with a modest budget. The color scheme is often muted and bland, and if you look for flaws, you'll certainly find them. They didn't do a good job with distant terrain, for instance, and some areas feel blatantly rather flat. The lighting is rather flat, the majority of things in the world aren't interactable, and facial models are extremely subpar. So, you know, typical lower budget game issues. You can also see a lot of asset reuse, and certain levels even feel incredibly copy and pasted, both visually and in gameplay terms. I'll hold off on the level design for now because I have a CVS receipt worth of problems with it. I should also mention the sound design here. It's pretty bad on average. Weapon sounds are an odd mixed bag. Some guns sound more like angry typewriters than anything else and are often lacking in bass. Reloading sounds are also usually louder than gunfire for whatever reason. Sound propagation is awkward at best and can result in cut-off sounds, silent gunshots, and enemies at a distance sounding a lot closer to you than they actually are. Similarly, NPC dialogue can be muffled or quiet when you're extremely close to them. Should you turn the game's volume up, then you get your ears brutally violated by the pre-mission briefing cutscenes in their horrifically compressed audio. A lot of sounds are both stock and reused ad nauseum. I complimented the atmospheric addition of things like mortar fire, but I hope you're prepared to hear the same explosion sound possibly thousands of times in one level. They didn't just get their mileage out of some of these sound effects, they got the entirety of Vietnam. Another case of this is how your allies probably have 2 sounds for taking damage in total. Their screams are so goofy that they would belong in Tom and Jerry before a game about the Indochina War. And since a good few of your allies are invincible and prone to being stun-locked, yeah, that amusement easily turns into annoyance. Starkly contrasting that audio pollution is the moments where the game is almost dead silent despite there being a lot going on. I feel like a lot of sound effects might be outright missing, like there being no sounds for bullet ricochets, grenade bounces, tanks driving around, etc. A lot of this may simply be audio mixing issues, so they do have sounds, it's just really hard to hear them. Whatever it is, all roads lead to this game having some of the worst sound design I have ever seen. Well, heard. There's no being happy here since it always wants to occupy polar opposite extremes. Constant noise or hardly any noise at all. You don't even get to pick your poison, the game picks for you. Shockingly, however, I was actually rather impressed by the soundtrack. It's arguably a generic and mediocre soundtrack, yet it stood out to me more than it had any right to. It's a lot of this heroic sounding orchestral music and rock, and the sniping mission you get a surprisingly catchy techno beat. Not a soundtrack I would casually listen to, but I do give some props for the above average variety and for rather successfully emulating its peers. I remembered a lot more of the soundtrack than usual, so good job 7554, you actually did please me here. As I've said, 7554 takes strongly after Call of Duty. There are 4 horsemen of shooters made in the late aughts to early 10s. Regenerating health, a 2 weapon limit, iron sights, and sprinting. 7554 has all of these and does none of them well. I want to make it clear that these aren't bad things by default. It's about both implementation and hitting this 4-way monopoly on post-Halo generic shooter tropes. Could pin these tropes on Call of Duty as well, which is more likely in 7554's case. Though on a personal note, I consistently hate iron sights. I vastly prefer to zoom in aiming at games like Fear. Speaking of, 7554's iron sights are awful. They tend to completely obstruct your vision and randomly get cancelled out. If you don't use them, your guns are hideously inaccurate, which was the style of the time. It doesn't help at all that getting shot applies severely over the top flinch and post-processing vomit to the screen. It's like every machine gunner fires a dizziness laser straight into your brain. Hitting things is often shockingly difficult in this game because of how much it loves throwing off your aim. For reasons I'll get to shortly, this is a huge issue. And naturally, sprinting is exceptionally wimpy, being your typical move 30% faster for 10 seconds type of sprint. Your military trained character is wheezing and hobbling like a chain smoker after briskly jogging for several seconds. Never understood this trend of military characters who could be outrun by a random underweight Joe like me. It's not like the ability to outmaneuver a dead sloth would upset the game balance. Even the 2 weapon limit is messed up. Instead of having a dedicated swap weapons button, you have to hit 2 or 3 on the keyboard to switch between each of your weapons. Hitting one swaps to a melee weapon that you'll never use, since there's a dedicated melee button that is far more convenient. To add to the misery, weapons are almost never placed on the ground. Weapons dropped by dead allies and enemies are quickly whisked away to wherever the French equivalent of purgatory is. So if you're low on ammo for a weapon, you have to luck out and find another copy of the weapon, or hope that you can scavenge another weapon entirely and find ammo for that. Weapons found on the ground rarely have more than 2 mags of ammo, which helps induce a survival horror level of ammo scarcity. The game rarely remedies this. Some levels actually do have weapon stashes scattered around, which opens the door to experimentation and lets me go wild with my favorite weapons sometimes. There's also exceedingly rare infinite ammo refills, but only for the sniper rifle and rocket launcher, strangely. It felt like an awful tease when, one of the few times I found something to refill my ammo, it immediately made the game crash. Thankfully, it was a fluke, and it never crashed the game again. The cherry on top of all of this is that they got the weapon swapping text prompt the wrong way around. So if you look at an MP40 on the ground while you have a Thompson equipped, it'll ask you if you want to swap your MP40 for a Thompson. Yeah, really. I imagine this is a translation error, but it's pretty impressive of a mistake to make in the first place. Was the English translation even playtested by human beings, let alone English speakers? And I've saved the most flawed of the 4 horsemen for last, Regenerating Health. It's an understandable inclusion, but its implementation here leaves wounds that will never heal. A lot of games with Regenerating Health don't do a good job communicating when you're low on health, and 7554 is a ridiculously extreme case. Sure, your screen slightly reddens and you get a heartbeat, but that's it. It primarily lacks clear visual cues for when you're close to death's doorstep, so I was consistently unsure if I was critically low on HP or if I could still peek out and get a couple more shots off. When I did die, I often felt like I had much less health than I expected. To be clear, I could always tell when I was shot. Telling how much damage I took from being shot was the problem. I want to point out that all it would take to remedy this issue that pervades every second of the game is a health bar. You are absurdly frail here, to the point where it isn't uncommon to die in half a second or so. I was always confounded when I got annihilated from full health, probably God himself smiting me with how sudden it was. Sudden and unfair deaths are the name of the game, or at least the subtitle. As one random example of many, the final level has this one spot where I kept getting one-shotted from full health with no obvious cause. In reviewing my footage, I realized that it was that tank. You may think it's obvious, but the abysmal sound work, lack of visual feedback, and the fact that the tank isn't even facing me made me believe I was being killed by something else entirely. By the way, dying there sends you back before an unskippable cutscene, just to give you an idea of how this game gets its rocks off. It's worth mentioning that the AI is aggressive with very little regard for its own life. They will charge you down for a melee tussle despite you being armed with an MP40. These aren't French tactics, almost the opposite. They're beating you with a white flag. They will oftentimes just stand out in the open to become living turret emplacements specifically to suppress you. Because of their ridiculous flinch and post-processing vomit when you get hit, you either have to luck out or wait until one of your allies finally decides to shoot the guy twiddling his thumbs in no man's land. Quite literally no man's land in many of the levels taking place in trenches. It also doesn't help that they have fairly bizarre grenade throwing habits. In one 30-second recording, I had at least 10 grenades hucked right at me. Luckily, it's only sometimes that the French hive mind decides in unison to carpet bomb some random guy in a tiny cabin. Throwing grenades back is finicky, and I wouldn't recommend trying to get kills that way. Speaking of grenades, the French threw more grenades at me in that one section than I threw in the entire game. I'm not joking. Between grenade pickups barely being present throughout the game, the fact that it takes multiple seconds to quick throw a grenade, and their long fuses, it's exceedingly rare that you'll get to use them in any fun or devastating ways. Also, while gathering extra footage of grenades, I found out that you can infinitely juggle grenades at your feet, since throwing them back seems to increase the timer, just like in real life. Don't try this at home though, I'm a trained clown. Back to the AI, they tend to target you more so than your allies. It's not like Darkest of Days where you can argue that even the Confederates would know to target the guy with the fully automatic death cannon of Super Death. Here you're some random soldier, like any other, who the French just happen to have their croissant out for. Their reactions are borderline instantaneous, and chances are they'll chew up 2/3 of your ambiguous health pool before you can even perceive them. They are pretty cognizant to an extent. I looked back at my footage closely to analyze this. This one clip in particular stood out to me. This guy shot me in 110 milliseconds of us being able to see each other. So yes, it's not instantaneous, yet in that comically small amount of time, far less than human visual reaction time, he saw me, identified me as a threat, aimed his gun, fired, and hit dead on. It seemed vaguely humiliating to get so utterly destroyed by random cannon fodder, but I knew something was up, so I'm glad I caught this Sasquatch on recording. Though even with my proof that the game is literally cheating, I still get humiliated in this clip, given that I died under a French flag. You ultimately have to play 7554 ridiculously cautiously because you have a measly pool of health with no health bar, actively detrimental visual cues, and no health gate. Compound that with the AI's absurd accuracy, reaction speed, and aggression concentrated on the player, and it ends up being hard because it's terribly balanced rather than genuinely challenging. Any risk more than popping your head out from cover for a brief moment can kill you quick. You just can't play this game particularly aggressively. Maybe you want to say it's realistic, but that train left when they included regenerating health in the first place. Should I mention I'm playing on hard mode? There's a difficulty above what I'm playing on. I'm glad I didn't go with that. You may be screaming, "Turn the difficulty down" at your screen. The problem is that normal mode swings too far in the opposite direction. You have maybe 5 times the health you have on hard mode, though this doesn't get rid of the issue of visual feedback. The AI is also affected in interesting ways by normal mode, being even more aggressive at the cost of being a lot dumber and less psychic. I do give the developers some points for tweaking the AI between difficulties. It's just that normal mode is so much more forgiving that I can charge in with my machete and survive. There is simply a gigantic gap between normal and hard with no happy middle ground. I committed to hard mode, but normal allows you to run and gun, so frankly it's probably the more fun way to play. I guess it's up to personal preference, but most of what I said in this review applies to hard mode. To stack one more design flaw on top of all of that, the basic movement mechanics of crouching and proning are clumsy. By default, you have a button for crouch, a button for prone, and a button to instantly stand up. 3 buttons that immediately override each other, but never themselves. You can't hit the crouch button a second time consecutively to stand up or go prone, for instance. I did gradually adjust to it, yet it still feels like playing a war-flavored QWOP. and naturally, crouching, standing, and going prone all cancel out your character reloading or cycling the bolt on rifles. Sprinting does the same as well. In a game where half the combat loop is getting off a couple shots and quickly ducking down, this is an absolutely laughable design mistake to make. Now, I admit that I've been negative so far, so it's time to shift to something more positive. The best aspect of 7554, it's Arsenal. It's a fairly typical All-Stars lineup of World War II weapons with a sprinkle of relatively obscure French and East Asian weaponry in there. Some popular inclusions are the MP40, Springfield, PPS-841, and BAR, and some relatively obscure inclusions include the Type 24, MAT 49, and FM24/29. You may want to know how well these firearms are depicted. As someone with only a mild passing interest in actual guns, I will say that nothing here stood out to me for being incorrect or weird. One big hint that the developers cared, at least somewhat, is the fact that your character removes stripper clips from rifles while reloading them. In addition, all of the guns are confirmed to have genuinely been used in the Indochina War, so there's no weird anachronisms or misplaced weapons here. Yeah, believe it or not, the MP40 was actually used by the French in this war. I'm sure some gun pedant out there has noticed 2 minor mistakes and already written an angry comment about how weird it is I don't have every last detail World War II firearms memorized, so the jury's probably still out on this one. As far as I can tell, the firearms are fairly accurate to their real-life counterparts. Given how games with bigger audiences and budgets often get these guns wrong in obvious ways, this absolutely helps 7554 stand out. While they're not necessarily my favorite renditions of these weapons, I can tell there's more love than average put into them. Every weapon has its own reload, pickup, equip, and melee animations in addition to empty reloads and bolt cycling animations where applicable. The animations can be a little choppy at times, though I only noticed this when I was looking closely. They went a bit above and beyond the Call of Duty here. Literally, Call of Duty just uses a generic knifing animation for most weapons. This game has a unique melee attack for every weapon in addition to a weird amount of borderline useless melee weapons. I find that melee is rather unsatisfying and lacking in feedback, so there's unfortunately no meaty fistings to be had here. I know, I'm sad too. I've heard both far better and worse Garand pings. I'll give it a 5 out of 10 just to be nice. Back to the guns themselves, they are satisfying to use and smooth to aim, when you are under fire of course. Seriously, that damage flinch is absolutely bogus and ruins a lot of the fun. Enemies usually only go down in a few shots, even from automatic weapons and the subpar pistols. Pistol headshots are a lethal takedown, but so are headshots from every other weapon in a game, so pistols just end up being the weakest weapon class. Even so, all of the guns give a pretty decent amount of feedback and their firing sounds are among the best sound work in the game. Enemies stumble, stagger, and get blown backwards on death, and their helmets pop off on headshots. It genuinely feels good to shoot things. The gunplay is good. Though you do get obnoxious hit markers which are redundant and rather unnecessary. And while your whole roster is fairly enjoyable to use, 7554 definitely favors its automatic weapons. The MP40 was my personal favorite, and some of my favorite moments in the game were when I got to cut loose with it. I do have some bias since I really love the MP40 no matter what. Most of the other automatic weapons feel good and handle well too, though I'm not too big into the FM24, it just doesn't feel as good as the competition. The bolt action and semi-auto weapons are also pretty good. They usually kill enemies in 1 to 2 shots, handle well, and have a satisfying retro rifle reload rhythm. You know the Arsenal designers did something right when landing headshots with a bolt action never started to feel old. Most of the weapons behave exactly as you'd expect, so they don't need too much more detail. However, there are a couple especially notable inclusions, one of which is the sniper rifle, the M91. I had fun with it, though it's not merely because it's a potent and accurate long-range rifle. It's primarily because of the hilariously janky slow-mo kill cams it gives you. I love how you can get them on missed shots too. That makes me laugh substantially more than it reasonably should, so I forgive some of this game's lesser sins in exchange. Only lesser sins though, that damage flinch is unforgivable. And 7554 has finally broken my viable video game flamethrower streak. The flamethrower here is not actually a flamethrower and is more like an industrial heater cranked a little low, or put more eloquently, it's like weaponized burning dog shit. It has a multiple second long firing delay and seems to affect a vastly smaller area than its visual cues let on. It shows up just once, sitting on the floor with no fanfare, so I almost wonder if they placed it there on accident. A similar case to that is the crossbow, which is so bad that I couldn't even tell if it was capable of doing damage. It doesn't help that it seems to fire up and to the left of the crosshair. I guess I should have known what I was getting into when I brought a children's toy onto the battlefield, so I have a soft spot for crossbows, so this makes me a little sad. Finishing this section up and looking at the gunplay and how it feels, it's odd that 7554 is so unpleasant otherwise. It's a genuinely satisfying, well-realized set of weapons in a shooter where almost every other aspect of the gameplay is miserable or poorly designed. The guns may feel good when you actually get to shoot bad guys, but the instant they shoot back, the enjoyment sharply drops because their bullets effectively summon small earthquakes. And that's assuming you even manage to get a shot off without them, well, shooting you first. With only a few tweaks to the feedback, core gameplay mechanics, AI, and general balancing, 7554 could easily be a competent shooter. As is, it largely comes across as wasted potential. However, there is one more big issue, and is that those hypothetical tweaks probably wouldn't be able to fully redeem the level design itself. I have to talk about the campaign itself and how sloppy, awkward, and even unfair it can be. I've joked before, I think it was in my Strife video, that I suspect a lot of level designers are sadists. Thinking back on it, I've come to realize that maybe I was onto something. I don't have a surefire way to quantify or evaluate this, it's more of a gut feeling than anything else. I just think that if you want to cause large numbers of people a lot of misery and frustration, becoming a level designer may be one of the better, safer ways to fulfill that fantasy in the modern day. 7554 is a pretty strong mix of malice and incompetence in my mind. I would argue it's the hardest game on my channel up to this point by far. Between how quickly you die, how badly some encounters are laid out, and how sporadically cruel it can be at checkpoints, it's an endurance test at times. Honestly, if I talked about every standout bit of nonsense, I could drag this video on for over an hour, so I'll just give you some of the juiciest bits and key points. To start with one of the biggest and most common issues, you're thrown for wave defense segments obnoxiously often, at least once per mission, going up to 4 times. It's suffice to say that half the playtime in most missions is wave defense sections. These tend to last for a stupid amount of time and never have a checkpoint until they're over. Some of these sections I have absolutely no idea how they intended you to beat them without hiding in a safe corner. That's not an exaggeration. Many of these fights are so poorly thought out that the only reasonable way through them is to find a comfortable corner and a nudie mag. On hard mode, second hardest difficulty by the way, you don't have the stats to properly take on many of the wave defense sections. It's like you're the protagonist of a survival horror game who accidentally walked into a horde shooter. Speaking of survival horror, even if you could practically fight, ammo is bafflingly scarce. There were numerous sections lasting upwards of 5 minutes where I had to make singular rifle mags go a very long way. Were this a horror game, I probably wouldn't be complaining, but this isn't a horror game. Just look at what's happening. It's so much completely incompatible design interlocking in one place that you'd think it's a modern democracy. The game is overly hesitant to give you ammo, so you're typically reliant on your AI partners and turrets to fight off the borderline endless hordes of Frenchmen. Turret emplacements would seem like a fast track to death in a game like this, but they give you a huge concession. You can crouch while on the turret. Shockingly innovative, actually. 7554 is unique in that its turret sections tend to be both short and tolerable. An ability to crouch on a turret is a big help in that. Still, you're gonna be doing a lot of wave defending here. It doesn't always do a good job communicating when you're in one of these sections, so I failed the first objective in the game because I wandered off unsure what to do. There's the bad translation coming into play as well, and yeah, the first mission opens with a wave defense section, probably to prime your brain for them as soon as possible. Hilariously, the only mission that didn't have a wave defense segment is about 5 minutes in total. They really didn't try to hide how padded this game is. The variety in objectives is ridiculously low. 98% of the time you're defending, following, or rarely assaulting things. One of the few mix-ups comes in the form of the Vietnam Sese bazooka. Yeah, aside from being a funny, glaring typo that should have been caught in playtesting, it gives me Vietnam flashbacks to that one time I made an 84-minute video on a bullet hell that nobody watched. Understandably, I have no one to blame but myself for that. Aside, when occasionally getting to fire a rocket launcher feels like variety, like a large deviation from the norm, you're stuck in FPS level design purgatory. It's a dull pain, that's for sure.
I can take it!
The most enjoyable sections are where you have forward momentum, where you can push forward instead of holding back. The very few times the game gets into an actual groove, it's quick to subvert itself in some baffling way. The encounter design is actually rather fascinating in some ways because there are signs of good level design, varied clustered cover, mixed sightlines, a bit of verticality, even circular navigability a couple times. It's just a shame that maybe only 10% of the level design at most is like this. The rest of it is nearly identical trenches and overly open jungle environments. And and area is obviously built for wave defense sections. Combat in the trenches isn't awful since it at least tends to be faster paced. You're just very boxed in with little freedom of movement or navigation. It doesn't help that trenches are effectively glorified corridors. Even still, the more focused sections can be pretty horrendous. The game's true antagonist is a Vietnamese jungle itself, which starred in the most miserable sections in the game fairly consistently. As much as I appreciate it visually, you can never use it to your advantage, because naturally, the French have heat vision and can hit you with World War II era SMGs from half a mile off while you're prone in dense foliage. When I'm constantly being shot at with perfect accuracy by mystery hostiles I can't see at all, it induces a strong feeling of rage and helplessness inside of me. It's honestly a miracle I didn't ditch this game after the final section of level 3, where it took me about 5 minutes to find and kill one singular guy sniping me from across a dense cornfield. He's the one surrounded in a jungle in a foreign country. He's supposed to be the one out of sorts, not me. I wasn't given a checkpoint for a very long time, so I had to play ridiculously carefully. I needed to take a break afterwards because I was so infuriated and stressed out. A first for a game on my channel. That's a great thing to feel while playing a video game, right? Stress? For a horrible section without the jungle, you only need to look at the literal second encounter in the game. It is brutal and may outright be the most difficult combat encounter I've seen in a shooter in years. It's a small circular set of corridors where you have swarms of enemies fiercely pouring in towards you. They have no regard for their own lives here, they want you dead. There is minimal cover and your only weapons are slow rifles. These rifles have small mags, slow reloads, and take multiple body shots to kill the average bad guy. These weapons would be fine if I wasn't getting aggressively swarmed by the psychic French horde pouring in like wine. They come in larger groups than you can reasonably handle and will dump damage on you the exact femtosecond they see a pixel of your elbow. This part is only possible thanks to the Molotovs the game gives you. Surprisingly, the French are smart enough to not turn themselves into foie gras. However, since they've apparently never seen fire before, they just stare at it in awe, giving you precious moments to regenerate your health in peace. This is the only time in the game I needed Molotovs, let alone for an actual tactical area denial purpose. It doesn't help that this is one of the only 2 missions where you get them in the first place. Why? I'm coming to you way later on to add 2 more things here. 1, I apologize for frequently dunking on the French. I love you guys. Hope a stock image of a guillotine can lift your spirits. 2, this encounter in particular is especially fascinating to me. It has a genuinely interesting layout and is structured in such a way that it could easily make for a fun and intense, aggressive defensive fight. It's easy to get flanked or swarmed, so you have to think on your feet and position yourself tactically. So it's a shame that thanks to the sloppy, incongruent gameplay mechanics and a lack of, say, a shotgun, this fight falls flat and ends up being hideously unfair rather than enjoyable. It's a great highlight of both the things wrong with the combat and how mishandled even a potentially good level design is. Your biggest advantage throughout the campaign is your fellow comrades. It's nice to have an infinite supply of allies on your side, though it's typically balanced out by the infinitely spawning Frenchmen. Assumedly they're rapidly asexually reproducing off screen. Anyways, your allies can kill things, but the caveat is that they love getting in the way and pushing you around, often into outright danger. For better or worse, you can't friendly fire them at all, though you can accidentally commit other war crimes. Your friends don't fare much better than you, as your unnamed allies still tend to die in unflattering ways. I guess standing still in the middle of a battlefield could still be considered an honorable death in battle. On the bright side, that's free ammo for you. Even the invincible named allies have some hitches, as they'll get into a weird stun lock while being shot, or they get so aggravated about the inconvenience that they start hilariously yelping like they're in Looney Tunes. They eventually break free, so it doesn't change the fact that you can just stand back and let them be the heroes. Despite that, it's not always as simple as letting your allies play the game for you. This is because it's laughable how bad the scripting and encounter flow is. Most highly linear scripted games tend to have a metaphorical curtain used to hide how scripted the encounters and set pieces can be. Well, 7554's curtain is made of the same substance as the pages in those tiny cheap Bibles. A good example of this is the number of segments that, at a glance, appear to have infinite enemy respawns. This is only technically the case because these enemy respawns are tied to invisible lines you need to cross. This segment on screen is an unwinnable fight unless you jump down into the trench below. Then an enemy respawns stop almost immediately and the fight ends in 30 or so more seconds. A lot of segments have this issue, and sometimes even in reverse. If you're like me and you often can't tell if the game is in the middle of a wave defense segment or if it just wants you across a doom line def, then a segment can devolve into a prolonged stalemate. What if it is a defense section and trying to push forward has a risk of sending me back to the start? What if I need to push forward and I'm just just wasting my precious ammo by sitting around. This is just a really unique problem to have. I've been racking my brain trying to think of another game with this same issue to no avail. There's so many messy little scripted set pieces, like this one part where you have to chase down a tank, which features one of the only QuickTime events in the game. If I'd never seen or heard of 7554 before and you showed me this scene, I would have assumed it was from some unpolished alpha build of some shooter that was never released. That's just how sloppy it is. To give a different example to messy scripting, just look to the entirety of the sniping mission I mentioned at the start of the video. One highlight is a part where you have to take down a lone enemy sniper. I feel like they wanted to have a dramatic sniper boss battle here, but the developers held a competition for who in the office could speedrun programming to fight the fastest. In my playthrough, this fight amounted to witnessing the sniper ice skating backwards like a cool guy, after which he took cover on a patch of moist air and died before he could get a shot off. This is supposed to be a boss, I think? Yet he put up less than a septillionth of the fight as some random rifleman I played Marco Polo with 5 minutes ago. Why does this get so much fanfare and build up? It also happens to be the only moment in a game like this. In any other case where you have to take down, say, a turret gunner, they're typically invincible but scripted to die after a certain amount of time passes. It's honestly kind of surreal, and it leads straight into my next point. The things done on timers are almost beyond parody. There are numerous segments that literally just ask you to wait. That's not a joke. One level in particular starts with 2 consecutive segments where you need to wait. That's your objective. They even give you a nice timer to help pass the time for the first time it wastes your time. They're quantifying the time wasting. That's bold. Periodically, you'll be tasked with an objective along the lines of resupply, where it'll give you a 30-second timer to do so. Failing to be at a certain point in this time is an instant game over. Why? It's hard to fail these, but it's a fundamental design incompetence that really irks me. The downtime for scavenging between fights is possibly the most stupid place imaginable to put a timer in a shooter. A lot of other games from this era have obnoxious NPCs pestering you to hurry up while you resupply, but putting a death timer on it is just next level absurdity. Timers are good for bomb sequences, underwater sections, time trials, and oh, I don't know, wave defense sections. It does sometimes get them right, like with a slow-mo hostage breach situation, yeah, they copied that too, and with a segment where you have to escape from a bomb. Just because someone on the development team figured out how to make a timer, probably the most advanced piece of code in the game, doesn't mean you should litter every part of the game with them. Yet, that's what they did. There's an out-of-bounds timer used to punish you if you go out of the intended area of the map. The problem is that they are often put in places where it looks like you could go, so you'll seemingly be in bounds only to suddenly be saddled with a 5-second death timer. The same happens when you get too far from a mission NPC. It's a quick game over. Yeah, serves you right for veering slightly off the intended path. I'll remind you once more of the all gillied up clone mission. I say clone because if I wasn't acutely aware the developers were genuinely trying, I'd call it a satire. It's as restrictive as its inspiration with a fraction of the spectacle and enjoyability. Hilariously, it's still probably the best mission in a game, or at least among the best. It has only one wave defense segment, and it's the biggest fight in a game in terms of spectacle and scale. It's actually tolerable because unlike every other wave defense section prior, you're given plenty of cover, long sightlines, and infinite ammo for a fun, viable weapon. If the quirky AI bullshit and scripting were ironed out, you'd have a passable enough all gillied up copycat on your hands. While it's on my mind, I will say that this game never dips its toes into forced stealth outside of one brief spotlight evasion section. This is a great spot to point to expose how shamelessly padded, scripted, and linear this game is. You're effectively stuck behind your comrades, smelling their farts while slowly crawling through grass as nothing happens. And it feels like it goes on for such a long time. I recorded the whole section, it was 2 minutes, yet it sure felt 10 times longer. I genuinely do not get the thought process. Did they think this was enjoyable or cinematic? Upskirting another man in tall grass for 2 dull minutes is neither of those things. Almost every segment in this game where you have to wait for something or follow someone could be cut in half or removed entirely, and the game would be nothing but better for it. 7554 is ultimately a very, very linear game. Any deviation from the path the developers set out for you is punished with a nonsensical reversion to the last checkpoint. There's almost no feeling of exploration, minimal sense of naturally progressing through the levels, and no way to do the mission objectives as you please. This is the worst kind of linear FPS in my mind. I have no inherent qualms with linear games. I thoroughly enjoyed The Hunt, Prey, Singularity, Undying, etc. All linear games I've talked about positively before. What sets this game apart is that if I were were to replay it in its entirety again, nothing would really play out differently. I would end up with the same weapons in the same places, taking cover in the same spots, struggling with the same encounters, sticking to the same allied NPC's bums like a boil, all while being subjected to the same old half-baked moment-to-moment gameplay. If you ask me, the level design may be the biggest nail in the coffin. Plus, all I've touched on here are the major issues. There are plenty of petty issues I didn't bring up, like the unnecessarily long walks, random stopgaps for dialogue, overly long-range fights, and so forth. If I was to go into detail on all of these smaller issues, this video could go on for another 10 minutes. There's only so many ways I could draw out the point that the campaign plays terribly. So instead, let's look at this game's final shot at redemption. Since 7554 is basically a mangled, shambling corpse, it's appropriate that they knew to include a zombies mode. I have a confession, which is relevant because it likely biases my opinion on this mode. I hate Call of Duty's zombie modes. Oop, there goes how many viewers and subscribers that cost me. It's mostly that I find endlessly kiting hordes of lumbering damage sponges to be the most unappealing thing imaginable in a shooter, right next to perpetual wave defense segments. It was just never for me. Well, it turns out 7554's survival mode is a bit closer to the likes of Killing Floor, though it's so bare bones that the orbital diagrams of the calcium atoms can be seen with the naked eye. You're trapped in a small area which is completely open from the start. The game transitions into night after a short period, which causes zombies to start randomly spawning. Each zombie you kill gets you points in increments of 100 based on their type. Things like headshots and melee don't factor into this, it's static. After a set number of zombies, increasing with each round, you get 30 seconds of daytime where you can safely buy items at the store. The store sells most of the items from the campaign in addition to ammo refills. There are some auto missions, so I'm not sure what's happening there. I assume the mode goes on endlessly until you die. An eternity of this garbage is probably only slightly preferable over an eternity in most interpretations of hell. I honestly got bored by Wave 8, though bear in mind that the waves get long very quickly. Like in the campaign, you have regenerating health, but you can take a surprisingly massive beating from the zombies, more than the wretched visual and audio cues let on. There isn't a distinct sound effect for the zombies hitting you, and it takes multiple swipes for your screen to turn red, so the feedback is still worse than that of the average asset flip. Thankfully, there seems to be little to no damage scaling with waves, so the different variants of zombies consistently go down with a reasonable amount of punishment. The king of this mode seems to be melee. Basic zombies get one-shotted, the hopping Jiangshi are two-shotted, and the armored zombies who accidentally wandered out of World of Warcraft are three-shotted. The basic zombies are somewhat interesting in that they can burrow around the map, and the Jiangshi are vaguely terrifying with their ability to fly around corners. Headshots do more damage, though aren't too practical without a fully automatic weapon. There is a combo system in place to reward kills made in quick succession, but it's rather finicky and unforgiving, to the point where it's hard to get a worthwhile combo without a lucky mag dump or grenade spam. I typically hate combo systems. This is a good reminder why. If you're keen on comparing this mode to Call of Duty's zombies, then it's stripped back at a few things that made that vaguely interesting and strategic, though kiting doesn't truly count as a strategy. This mode has no perks to buy, no objectives or areas to unlock, no mystery box, no power-up drops, no barriers to repair. Feel like I'm scraping the bottom of the barrel with that one. You name it, it's just missing almost everything. Survival mode here is just endless swarms of a handful of basic variants of zombies charging you down in almost pitch dark. All you have is a store that sells guns and some purchasable mounted turrets scattered about. I guess the closest it has to anything particularly interesting is the aforementioned combo system, but even that has a depth of a kiddie pool. What more can I say, really? It's a mode about kiting zombies around reused maps from the campaign. They're frail zombies that have some variety in their characteristics, but it's still trash. It is far too mechanically minimalistic to be interesting. There's almost no progression because once you get the guns you want, assuming you don't stick to melee, you can endlessly restock all ammo for an easily earned kilo. The store does stay open during the night, but shopping for guns at 3 AM can go wrong and lewd. So yeah, that's the only real depth to this mode, vague ammo management. Like I said, I don't like Call of Duty Zombies, but I'd much rather play that than this bland minimalist mockery of it. If there's one thing I can give the main campaign to 7554, it's that it didn't outright bore me. It frustrated me, sure, but there were fleeting moments of enjoyment in it. There was ambition, but the design consequences of that misplaced ambition made a somewhat fascinating double-edged sword. It's depressing that that's the most positive thing I can whip up about this game. Yeah, I respect it for trying, too bad it gets a D- at best. With Survival, there's almost nothing. I can tell it was thrown together last minute, probably more for marketing to the actual Call of Duty audience than anything else. Maybe if you like Call of Duty Zombies, you'll find some vague appeal to this mode. For me, it's the gameplay equivalent of ASMR. I was slowly falling asleep playing this. I don't know, this just isn't worth the time, honestly. Okay, so I brain farted and am only remembering this at the last minute while stitching this Frankenstein of a video together. There is another version of the zombies mode. It's fundamentally the exact same thing, wave-based survival in a big arena with some respite to buy gear. The difference is you're up against hordes of French instead of zombies. Instead of being like Call of Duty Zombies mode, it's more like Modern Warfare 3's survival mode, which I spent way more time with than zombies. So by default, I found this to be more fun of 7554's survival modes, though that's not saying much. This mode seems to be locked to normal difficulty, and the AI feels even dumber here than in the main campaign. Ultimately, I don't have any beef with this particular mode because it's not desperately trying to be something else. If you enjoyed the combat in the campaign, well, hey, you've got a couple arenas to fight the infinite French horde in. I'd rather be slapped by the French than be shot by the zombies. At least my enemies having guns keeps me on my toes. Overall, these survival modes are nothing special. Cute bonus content, but honestly, just do yourself a favor and go to Call of Duty for vastly superior versions of these exact same modes. 7554 really isn't worth the price of admission, and it was free. And now we're into the concluding thoughts. I'm coming to you numerous months after recording the previous section to just say that 7554 is a bad game once more. While I did make the bulk of this review back in November, this game is exhausting to the point where I had to take a break. I simply had to stew on this for longer than any other game I've ever played. I wasn't sure if my dislike was just in the moment or if it really was an objectively massively flawed game. Honestly, I'd say it's both, maybe lean into the latter. Perhaps I've been overly harsh, but honestly, even if you're hungering for a title in the style of old Call of Duty, you're better off just replaying, say, World at War. 7554's redeeming factors are few and far between. Yeah, it's an ambitious game, and I do respect that. The problem is that it aims for the stars only to hit a bird a dozen feet up. The list of things wrong with it is immense. The difficulty is awkward, either being too easy or blatantly unfair. The level design is ridiculously clumsy and full of sins I've never seen before in another shooter. The overarching story of the Indochina War is presented in a painfully bland way, and the stories of the protagonists are more threadbare than, I don't know, metallic cube. The graphics can actively inhibit the gameplay in some levels, and they don't even bother trying to mask how often they reuse the exact same trenches. The sound work is so wild and bizarre that I have to imagine the audio designer was a Jerboa from Mars, and survival mode is a sleep aid more than anything else. The fleeting good things, the weapons, the music, the concept, the history, sometimes the aforementioned ambition, are relatively minor and are brutally stomped out by the mountain of bad things piled on top. For every good moment, there's 10 bad moments. Finding joy here is like finding the hay in a needle stack. To come back around to something I said somewhat offhandedly earlier, yeah, sure, the gunplay is alright. The most significant good thing this game has going for it is that the guns felt decent enough, but stack everything else I've complained about on top of that, and I feel like it hardly matters. Thinking this gunplay redeems the game is like thinking bike customization redeems Ride to Hell Retribution. It's a drop of honey in a honey bucket submerged in a sewer. It's all such a shame. I try to see the good before the bad in things I cover. I've probably spoken far more positively of certain titles than anyone else on the internet, so for a game to trigger such an immense negative response out of me, well, it's rare. I was sitting there after beating this game, stuck in the stream of consciousness I get into when I write these scripts, almost incapable of thinking of anything but negative things to say. This is a rare catastrophe of a game, certainly not objectively the worst thing in the world, but I really don't ever want to play it again. It doesn't even have the caveat of being amusingly bad, it's just a painfully derivative shooter with miserable writing, gameplay, and level design. To quit beating around the bush used to get past the 10-minute mark, this is the worst game I've covered on my channel by far. Considering some of the stuff I played prior, that is a scary title to have. Thief 4 is my vote for the worst game I've covered, and now that title has been stolen. How ironic. I wouldn't call 7554 the worst game I've ever played, though I could imagine it easily finding its way into the bottom 10 or 20. It's honestly kind of a shame, since I expected a hidden gem going in. Yeah, I got a hidden gem alright, one that's probably cursed me and my family. Guess it happens to the best of us. 7554 actually gave me gaming on Wii, so from now on I'm going to be much more hesitant to cover outright bad games. I think good games and ones I'm more ambivalent on make for far more interesting and fun videos. I want to focus on proper hidden gems and strange outliers from this point onward, and hey, respectively I have a hyena flavored horde shooter and a contentious angry dad stealth game on my schedule. Stay tuned, I'll see you then.